Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. We have so many studies that show if you have a behavior that's followed by a consequence, let's say it's positive, there's an increased likelihood that that's going to happen in the future. And Doug Kostewicz.
We behave differently because it was determined for us. It's not determined for all.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everyone and welcome to ABA On Call. Today we have another treat for you, and that is Doug is still out and we have an amazing, and I'll put that emphasis on amazing, co-host in David Cox. For those of you that don't know David, right now he's the Chief Data Officer at Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, and he has had just an incredible run of working with tech in behavior analysis, which I guess I forgot to say, the theme of our episode today is going to be future tech and ABA, and I can't think of anyone better in all of ABA to be co-hosting this particular topic. So David, welcome.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Rick. I'm really excited to be here and very honored to be on this podcast. And yeah, fun topic.
Yes.
For sure.
No, we have, when people think about tech, let's just jump right into it and start talking about our segments. And the first one is looking at what we want to get at today is have a conversation about some of the tech and what it could be doing for behavior analysis, and if there are things that are going on in behavior analysis. So our first topic is getting at wearables. In wearables, we haven't talked about this before, but if I'm going to hold this up right now, I have my Apple Watch and I have my Oura Ring. And if I had more wearables that gave me this kind of excellent information, I would do it. So how about you? What kind of wearables do you use?
Oh, yeah, great question. So I think the biggest one that I take advantage of is my smartphone. And this is a kind of a under-discussed but very highly leverageable technology in the wearable space. So my iPhone I do a lot of stuff with just from daily tracking in terms of steps, movement, geolocation, things like that for my runs. I also have a smartwatch that I use that I, in particular, again, for step tracking and then for a lot of my running and training, physical activity training. So those are the biggies that I use.
You know, a lot of people, it's interesting, a lot of people wouldn't think about their phone as being a wearable, because when you think about a wearable, you literally think it's a wearable, but that phone's in your pocket, that phone can be attached to you, so that's a really good point.
Oh, yeah. And there's some interesting stats, too. I think it's like 4 out of 5 adults in the world have a smartphone. And so though there may be other wearable technologies that perhaps are more accurate or reliable or valid, the reach with smartphones is so tremendous that learning to leverage that could be really, really powerful.
So everyone that's probably listening to this at some level gets tech. Otherwise, if you're listening to the podcast or YouTube, you get the tech thing. My question to you would be, what do you either know about in terms of our field engaging wearables, and what would be some things that we could do, if there's not a lot of literature out there, some things that we could do in the future for wearable tech and ABA?
Oh, yeah, good question. So I think the main area that I've seen, and this might be perhaps tinged by my learning history and research, but the main area where I've seen a lot of wearable technology used is related to substance abuse or other patterns of behavioral health. And the really unique thing, so I kind of came from ABA for individuals with ASD and DD, pivoted over to the more behavioral health realm. And the first thing that popped out is where I get, 20, 30 hours of direct contingency control in the, more ABA setting with individuals with ASD. In the behavioral health space, you maybe interact with folks once a week, 15, 20 minutes, and it's usually vocal-verbal exchange. So you immediately have to get creative. How am I going to measure behavior? How am I going to measure the environment? And the substance abuse literature in particular has done some really fun stuff in this area, both from like prompting people to send out kind of surveys throughout the week. What are you doing? Where are you at? Using GPS, where individuals going? How does that relate to use patterns? There's a smartphone carbon monoxide monitors that you can get measurements of how much people have been smoking kind of out in the wild. So that's kind of the big area I've seen. The other two, I think, really fascinating areas that's more on the research end right now is a few people have looked at automating functional analyses or functional assessments via wearable technologies. So one group is in, I believe, Atlanta at Emory, and they we're looking at self-injurious behavior specifically in highly controlled lab settings, cameras and wearable technology, and they got pretty good results there. Another one involved automated functional behavioral assessment in adults with dementia, which I think is very similar in terms of the stuff they were looking at. We could translate that to a lot of the stuff that many behavior analysts engage in. So
that is fascinating to think about the behavioral health angle. A lot of times, if you go to the BCB website and you see that little pie chart that says most of the people are working in autism and developmental disabilities, but yet we have this huge world out there. And I happen to be involved in a study at Penn State where if you use the Garmin has this algorithm where they come up with a stress number. And of course, how they come up with that from your heart rate and even some contact with your skin. Like there's a lot of other kind of biometrics that they're engaged in. And I don't know if you recall, maybe it was a few years ago when there was that incident at YouTube where someone was angry and went in with a gun, and that really freaked people out. So a lot of folks are using wearables to help with stress, and they have these numbers which they're apparently proprietary because it's really hard getting them to help work with us, where they say that they have these numbers that show if here's the red zone, here's a zone where you need help, and here's your good zone. And I think that functional analysis is a beginning step, but wow, where could we go in our field if we started integrating that kind of tech with our clients?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fun to think about. And as you were kind of saying that, I immediately thought of heart rate monitors generally, or even there are these cool headbands that you can wear that get data on neural activity and whatnot. And kind of like you're saying, start pairing that stuff with, just have individuals wear that while they're contacting ABA therapy or whatnot. And we can think about all the research opportunities, MOs, private events, all those things. Perhaps we can start exploring some of that area. And the self-management angle, I had never really thought about that before. That's really cool that you all are looking into that. Not just how can we do it with clients, but employees.
With the tech, and it's interesting you talking about the headbands. It's almost a double-edged sword because we're living in a world right now where the tech is just flowing. And I remember, I can't remember, maybe it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but someone was selling this band that you put around your head to track your sleep. Well, it turned out that band was burning people, and it was really not good tech.
Oh, wild.
And there's so much out there. How do you sift the good from the bad in terms of if it's your own personal use, but also if you're like, hey, I want to track my client's sleep data, which is incredibly important. When you talk about MOs and you think about sleep, what are people to do in terms of looking at and trying to ferret out the good tech from the bad tech?
Oh yeah. Fortunately, because wearables have become such a big thing, there's a number of review articles that seemingly there's one a year that pops up. How are wearables being used in technology? So often at the beginning of any study or anything I'm a part of, I'll try to find that latest review article and figure out what's accurate, what's valid, what's reliable. I think kind of to your to your point also, though, just because it's been published in research doesn't mean it's cost-effective, accessible, or that there may be unintended side effects that people are just not aware of. So it's really interesting. The rate that tech is changing, too, made me think of this this article by this guy, can't remember his first name, Moore. I'll see if I can find it. But he was saying because the rate of digital technologies are changing so fast, as researchers, we have to get away from the idea of thinking about focusing on a technology and more so on the digital principles that are being used. So that way you can at least be consistent with that as your technology and stuff is updating through a study or over time. But yeah, it's fun to think about.
I love that thought of focusing on the digital principles, because that's absolutely hits home. Once you learn something, or once something's out there, like think about the iWatch. Every single year that is being updated and evolved. So what I'm wearing is not the most current. What's the most current version? Is it the 7? I think it's the 7.
That sounds right.
What's that?
Yeah.
And this is a 6. And, the change from the 6 to the 7 is really small, and it's not worth, like most of the time, I'll admit this to everyone, I'm an Apple fanboy. I have been an Apple fanboy since I was an undergrad. Like the first computer I learned on was a Mac Classic, so I'm really dating myself.
Oh, yeah.
It's been amazing. And I'm not updating, but normally every year when one came out, I would get a new smartwatch, but I'm not doing it this year because the things are incremental. But understanding if this is something that people are going to look at and apply, thinking about these bigger principles, I think that's just a phenomenal comment and a good way to think about how might you integrate this if you're working with your clients, and digging into the literature and looking at some of the things that you were talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. I'm curious. I don't have an Apple Watch. I'm trying to determine whether or not I convert over from Garmin. It has a lot of nice features and additional. I'm a big fan of the data tracking movement, and so I've been tracking all my behavior for about 10 years now. And that the new Apple Watch does offer some nice data collection modalities that don't exist with Garmin. So.
It's a really good point. So I will disclose to everyone a little health information. I was born, I have a congenital heart issue where my heart has the wall is thickened. And it's nothing severe, but I do get it checked out periodically. And so I go to the Cleveland Clinic, and I was talking to my doctor there, and I was looking at my VO2 max or whatever, which is something, and I'm like, this is really bad. And he's like, look, calm down, don't worry about it, because they did a study and showed that people who have arrhythmias, that the Apple Watch is just not very good at picking that up. So he was working with people who had known issues. So to your point, although tech is really cool and you have these things, we still have to be cautious of it. Like this Apple Watch is just a 1-lead ECG, and when you go to your doctors, there's 12 leads on you. So, there's that part, and then there's also the caution that I think we have to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points. All data in context.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to talking about our secret word, which is explore. So the secret word is explore. Let's move on and talk about another area of tech, which is artificial intelligence in machine learning. Now, a lot of times when people think about, they hear about artificial intelligence, they'll think about the Terminator movies or some dystopian future that Hollywood is trying to serve up to us. But you spend a lot of time in this space, and you, from what I know, are in groups where you help mentor people, and in terms of coding and in terms of understanding AI and machine learning. So tell us, what is artificial intelligence generally?
Yeah. So artificial intelligence very broadly refers to any attempts to create systems that mimic the behavior of living organisms, often humans. So for example, humans, we can see around the environment and then move within the environment without running into things. And so like the area of artificial intelligence that's focused on identifying objects in a field would be computer vision, and then robotics would be the field of artificial intelligence that moves those robots around without running into things. Humans also have very unique skills with verbal behavior, so there's a whole area of artificial intelligence focused on natural language processing and natural language understanding. How can we get silicon-based systems to understand language? And then there's machine learning more broadly is focused primarily on very large sets of data and kind of learning from interactions with the environment. And there really what machine learning boils down to is kind of pattern recognition at scale. So if I have these large data sets, how can I sift through everything that's there, identify patterns, and then give that information back to the researcher, whoever's using it?
That's phenomenal description of both AI and ML. And there's all of these other terms in there, which if we had like an hour or more, we could talk about how all of these things are connected. But the AI is something that if you look around in the business industry or healthcare, you see all of this research being done with AI. And when I think about our field and I look around, I don't see hardly anyone bringing AI. Now, there are some exceptions, and there are some people out there that are starting to think about this and starting to do things, but compared to other industries, just think about how many of you watch YouTube. If you're watching us right now, you're on the YouTube. When you go to YouTube, there are all of these selections, which AI and maybe even more specifically machine learning with these algorithms are figuring out what are your preferences. And they're going to feed you all of these preferences. And when I start thinking about where we are in the industry and where we could go in behavior analysis, wow, I get shivers thinking about what we could do with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that those kind of recommender systems that you mentioned are one of the early reasons that I started getting interested in artificial intelligence. A lot of my basic research is kind of choice preference. How can we use assessments to understand reinforcer value or punisher value, things like that. And then I saw these recommender systems that, exactly as you were saying, they're doing that at scale. They're using all this data that humans are generating just moving about life. And through that data, they're able to identify preferences and serve up content and kind of automate that whole system, which I think is just fascinating. And if behavior analysts could leverage that, I think it would be tremendous.
I was reading a story not too long ago. When we talk about artificial intelligence, people think about maybe chatbots, and or even when you talk about natural language processing, when you understand human speech, basically what you're doing is you're talking. That's being translated by natural language processing, is being fed into this database. And if you're like, hey Siri, or hey Google, or Alexa, or however you're supposed to summon these agents, you say your question, it goes off to the cloud, and then it comes back with an answer. And the story was about a young man who the mom was saying he had autism, and the mom was saying that his best friend was Alexa. And it was really the story of this mom saying how her son could have all of these conversations with Alexa, and Alexa would always have the same voice tone, and Alexa would, but the son's best friend became Alexa.
Yeah.
Thought, wow, that's something when you start thinking about
really
technology
neat.
And where it could go.
Oh, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of some of those, I think they're called like care robots or loneliness robots or something, that are being used over in China, where it's same idea. Can I give a robot to someone that may not have a lot of human interaction, and then through using these algorithms and what we know about both computer science and human behavior, can you create systems that are, can provide companionship? I think it's a very, very noble mission, the people that are working on that stuff.
Yeah, that's absolutely going to grow. I happen to be working on research right now, and it's called socially assistive robotics. And that's a field where, just like you said, the robot is being used, and of course, all those robots are powered by AI. And where that goes, this is what I'd like to say to people who are listening. Get in on this if you can, and let me ask this question to you. You have, at least in terms of people I know, you're doing a phenomenal job working with people and helping grow a number of people with in the behavior analytic community. They're interested in coding. So can you talk about, like, if people are interested in learning more about code, like what would they do and what would be their path and journey into either learning how to do it or at least leveraging it so that they could inform themselves and maybe work with some other people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing to figure out if you're interested in this area is kind of what you want to do with it, because you can use coding to like build experiments or for data analytics or for like robotics or something like that. So kind of figuring out, what do I want to do with this, and then finding mentors or resources to help you kind of get started in that area. And that's where that group, Behavior Analysts Who Code, that you kind of mentioned, I think is a lot of fun, because it's a group of people who just volunteer their time, they're passionate about coding, and they help each other learn skills. So that's kind of the first step, kind of figuring out what do you want to do in this area. And then after that, I think there are different levels that you can also get involved. So at one level, you decide you're really interested in programming and the algorithms underneath it, and then that would be kind of one track of learning and where you might go in your career. A second area would be, you're not really interested in coding, but you really want to help bring these technologies into your place of work or your type of research. And that kind of path would be more like high-level learning, what's going on, and then pairing with a researcher who knows the coding and algorithm. And then a third path, which I think is perhaps arguably the most important, is that maybe you don't want to code and you're not really interested in being like the translational researcher or practitioner, but you love this stuff and you want to see it explode. There, I would say volunteering your data or helping feed these systems, because a lot of these algorithms and whatnot, they get better the more types and variability in data sets that we have and the larger those are. And usually data is the rate limiting step with most of this stuff. So you can contribute in that way too if you're interested.
That's excellent. I sometimes think about, boy, I should just learn more coding, but that higher level can be very valuable. You were talking about machine learning, and one of the things that I do is I'll watch, I have a constant YouTube play. When I'm eating lunch, I'll be watching things just to see what's new. I'll try to read and catch up. But I was watching this one where just when you think about how machine learning is this very specific algorithm, and let's say you want to differentiate, you want to teach the machine the difference between these are pictures of dogs, these are pictures of cats. And it dawned on me as I was listening to them, and they were talking about their different examples. I started thinking about instructional design and what some of our folks in behavior analysis were done. And I was like, wow, they're really trying to teach concepts here to machines, which is fabulous in terms of what we could do and how we could contribute.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think the big thing that you're highlighting there is that often to pull off any kind of artificial intelligence, you need that domain knowledge from wherever you want to plug it into. And so though computer scientists or engineers, we can build those algorithms and those systems, unless we have somebody helping give us that feedback from an operand or a respondent perspective, it'll probably be limited in some capacity. The other thing that I think is interesting about that too is kind of the flip side. There's been a lot of time spent trying to figure out how to most effectively teach these systems, those concepts, if you will, dog versus cat. And I often wonder, is there something that we could learn from that as behavior analysts too? Are there ways we could be more efficient in our systems, or how we're presenting stimuli, or what that looks like? It'll take I think a handful of interested people in this to really figure this stuff out, but it's definitely fun to think about.
Well, they do have the term reinforcement learning, which gets at machine learning, and it's not exactly what we're talking about when we talk about reinforcement, but it is interesting, the similarities in how with reinforcement learning systems, how the machine's learning itself, which is incredible.
Oh, it's amazing. And Jack McDowell in particular, I think, has some really interesting work. He's created a system. He has, I think, 4 or 5 studies published now on these computational models of selection. I believe that's the phrase he uses. But he builds artificial organisms that he runs in the lab, these kind of experiments and simulations. And the idea is, if I hard program in what we know about operant behavior in the environment, can I get an artificial organism that mimics the behavior that we see of rats and pigeons? And his work has been pretty, I think, convincing to this point. But yeah, it kind of speaks again to that realm of reinforcement learning, kind of the interplay between technology and behavior analysis, and how both sides could probably use each other to improve what they're doing.
I absolutely love the fact that we're moving down that space, and the more people in behavior analysis that can get into this, the better. Well, that brings us to our next secret word, which is tech. That brings us to our last segment, and let's talk about analytics. We've talked about some wearables, we've talked about AI and ML, and that it's a nice progression, because now when we discuss analytics, this is a term where if you just put that in Google, you're going to have millions of hits. So many people are working on analytics. And I wrote a blog post about the difference between metrics and analytics. And this is the way I described it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But metrics would be just very simply things that you're counting. Let's say that you're Starbucks and you want to know, how many people are ordering your pumpkin spice latte. That's a metric. You can count that, by the hour, by the day, by the week, by the region, whatever. Analytics, on the other hand, would be ways of bringing statistical information together that can help answer a very important question. So if you wanted to, if you're Starbucks and you said something like, well, I'm interested in knowing if I run a particular promotion, does that promotion, will that help more people, come into Starbucks and buy a pumpkin spice or whatever? So an analytic is something, it's this way of using these stats to help you to derive knowledge and to understand whatever it is you're working on better. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's how I think about it also. I don't think I've ever heard anybody frame it using those terms in that way, but I would agree with it. How I've often heard about it is the difference between data and information. Same idea, metric or data, the thing that we've collected, and then analytics get you to that knowledge or information that you're doing it for some reason. What's the question or the purpose? Or so I like that way of thinking about it.
Let's talk about something where analytics has made a big splash. I mean, it's splashed all over the place, but have you seen Moneyball or read that?
Oh, I love Moneyball.
Okay,
yeah,
so for those of you who haven't seen this is the story about Billy Beane and the Oakland A's and how they used something called sabermetrics, and they took these analytics to try to figure out how could they get value from existing players out there, because baseball is worth billions of dollars, and they use these analytics to figure out these metrics, which later turned into these analytics, to figure out how could they draft good players, get value from them. And the story was amazing. They won 20 games in a row, and maybe they won the World Series.
Changed the face of the game. And I'll admit I'm a big baseball guy, but if you look at pretty much any team right now, they all have some kind of analytics department. They're playing around with that stuff to try to give information to the coaches and managers, mainly because of Billy Beane showed how effective it can be. So,
and it's not just baseball. It's football. It's soccer. You pick the sport. I was watching
NBA
football the other day, and they're like, they're talking about the coach. Should you go for it on 4th and 2? And they were saying how the numbers, the analytics, tell them yes, and they indeed did that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's so amazing. And I think that's where I really start to get excited looking at those demonstrations in broader society and thinking about behavior analysis, because we know we can't run experiments and control all variables that exist in the world, and these analytical methods give us an opportunity to play with data in perhaps unique and different ways, bring in more variables and try to make sense of what's going on to improve decision making, kind of exactly as you're saying.
So you're the chief data officer at the BHCOE. Where, if I could ask, where is that organization's head when it comes to thinking about analytics in our field of behavior analysis?
Oh, yeah, great question. So I think, for those that aren't familiar, Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, they currently provide one primary product, if you will, and it's organizational accreditation for ABA companies. And so for that, each company, when they sign up to get accredited, we collect a bunch of data on systems, processes, patient satisfaction, employee satisfaction, clinical care, things like that. And then they get back a score. Here's kind of how you score overall on things you're doing well, and they can get a 1, 2, or 3 year accreditation. With that, we then have, over the last 5 years, we've gotten these large data sets for every company that's gone through it. And I think we're a little over 500 or 600 organizations in total at this point. And so how we're thinking about playing with these data is essentially starting to analyze, using machine learning or these advanced analytic techniques. Are there patterns in the data set that we see across the field of ABA? Are there certain organizational characteristics or client or patient characteristics that would allow us to predict, one organization or one type of ABA intervention might be better for one person or another. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about. We recognize we have these large data sets, and we're beginning to explore what are the ways we can understand trends and patterns in the industry, or at least for the organizations that we've seen, so that we can then give that back to the field and, at least have conversations about some of the topics. So,
that's amazing. When I think about organizations that are set up to leverage all of this data, that's certainly one of them. And thinking more broadly, though, I wonder how you think about analytics in general and where might be some places we can go. If you look at healthcare or business or whoever, but let's just stick with healthcare, the analytics industry is through the roof. Just the other day, I don't know how this came on my radar, but I was looking at this company, and it's like 3 guys, and these 3 men have a company that's worth like $2 billion, and all they do is generate healthcare intelligence around these analytics. And I was like, wow, it's amazing, because there's so much value in these analytics. If you can understand, you were talking earlier in an earlier segment about substance abuse, but people who end up at the hospitals for heart issues or for diabetes or for whatever, if you can somehow use analytics and they give you information and it cuts down on the instance, it improves people's quality of life. But again, these insurance companies who are paying for it, they want to have less of the money. Those kinds of things are what I think we can have, and I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. So what's your thinking on where we might go, and what are some things that we could do?
I think there are kind of 2 areas that are seeming like easy next steps for behavior analysis in this area. The first, and both of these are being done in other areas of healthcare. So one gets back to that analytics or analyses surrounding organizational systems and processes as it relates to patient outcomes. So just like the hospital, when someone comes in and has, say, heart surgery, they want to try to maximize the likelihood that person doesn't come back. They're readmitted within 30 days or they suffer adverse effects. Similarly, ABA organizations, we have all these systems and processes at play. If we were to collect just a little bit of data on what we're doing, our decision making, we can probably start running some of these same analytics to then improve patient outcomes, reduce rates of recidivism or readmission, or however we want to look at that stuff. So that's kind of one area, like an OBM kind of analysis. The second area, which I think is just utterly fascinating, is this idea of patient-provider matching. So we know that most physicians and probably most behavior analysts, we're not good at everything, but we're probably really good at 1 or 2 things. And so the idea here is playing around with these large data sets from healthcare systems to figure out this doctor is very good in helping these kinds of patients. And then within a network, you can match the patients and providers so that way you can, again, maximize outcomes, or at least it'd be predicted that you'd maximize outcomes. And that's another area I don't think we've really even thought about or explored in behavior analysis. And I'm sure there are organizational challenges, who has availability in their caseload, they're probably going to get the client. But if we start thinking about these things, we might be able to do better in terms of building caseloads and helping patients and clients to greater extents.
I will admit that maybe a couple weeks ago, there was an excellent paper that was put out by your organization, the Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, and they were talking about a number of things. And one of them was like cleaning your data and how do you keep your data. And I was struck by thinking about just that alone, if our field could somehow, they were talking about the demographics, if we could just do a better job in inputting, let's talk about a child. Let's say that you're working with a child. The parents, are they married? Maybe other familial kinds of variables, even basic information that's out there that, we may not like intelligence tests or some of these other tests, but it's a data point. And maybe a GARS or CAR, if we had this information and then we had the behavioral data, just that alone, if we took a number of people and we started looking at the interventions that are being done, we would learn incredible things about the people that we're serving. And I have no doubt that we would have some insights that would help us move our field forward and elevate behavior analysis.
Oh, yeah. I agree 100%. And I think, all those variables, all those things we know I can't control in a lab, right? If I were to come in and say, I don't know, I'm going to look at the effectiveness of ABA for across varying severity of ASD diagnoses or something. That's something that I can't systematically manipulate in the lab. But to your point, if we start collecting data on those variables, those kinds of things, that even if we think they might be relevant or might not, these kind of more advanced analytic techniques allow us to rule in and out variables. And, over time as a field, we can start to figure out, what is the set of metrics that are really helpful for maximizing the effectiveness of our services.
We are towards the end of this segment and the end of our podcast, but I wanted to ask you one last question. We only covered a few things here. What would be some other areas of tech that should be on people's radar?
Yeah, I think the two biggies that I'm really interested in right now are virtual reality and augmented reality. I think both of those open the door to really interesting opportunities to play around with stimulus presentation to individuals, either for staff training, maybe for patients or clients directly. Or, I also enjoy just thinking about self-care, self-management, virtual reality. I've had some fun there on my own. But, I think those are kind of the two big areas, virtual reality and augmented reality, which are underexplored generally in healthcare. But I think behavior analysts, we could really learn to leverage those. We could do some fun stuff.
Excellent. Well, our third secret word is today. David, thank you so much for being my co-host. This was a phenomenal conversation, and I hope folks really took a lot away from this, because there's, tech's not stopping, and there's a lot that our field has to offer when it comes to integrating it, and honestly, like yourself, getting in there and actually driving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having me on the podcast, Rick. I know this is a lot of fun, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for listening and coming to ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.